Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Extinction Rebellion, the climate crisis protest group, has won a legal challenge against the Metropolitan Police following the force's decision to ban the group's protests across London. Lawyers for Extinction Rebellion say the Met now faces claims for false imprisonment from potentially hundreds of protesters. Daniel Sanford reports.
For 7 days, Extinction Rebellion protesters brought parts of London to a standstill, stretching police resources to the limit. On the 8th day, organisers adopted a tactic from the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement, in which protesters are told to be like water, to flood a site and then when police arrive quickly move on to another location, causing as much disruption as possible. At that point, the superintendent in charge banned all Extinction Rebellion protests in London, a decision the High Court today ruled unlawful.
We're delighted with today's result. It vindicates our belief that the police's blanket ban was an unprecedented and now unlawful infringement on our right to protest.
It also opens the way for those who were detained for breaching the ban to sue the police for unlawful arrest.
We're disappointed by the ruling, but clearly we absolutely respect the court's decision, and what we need to do now, I think, is in slow time carefully consider what it means for us and review our tactics in light of it.
So the police now have a challenge. How do they deal with the be water tactic of protesters when lots of mini protests keep popping up all over the place? The judges were clear that a city-wide ban won't wash, it's unlawful. So police will have to revert to dealing with each mini protest one by one, with all the implications for resources that involves. Police said today they spent more than £24 million policing Extinction Rebellion's autumn uprising and said it had caused unacceptable and prolonged disruption. Daniel Sanford, BBC News at New Scotland Yard.
Environmental protesters from Extinction Rebellion have won a legal challenge against the Metropolitan Police. The High Court ruled the force's decision to impose a blanket ban on the group's demonstrations in London last month was unlawful. The action led to almost 2,000 arrests, and as our correspondent Juliette Bremner reports, it could lead some of those detained now suing the Met.
Congratulations for the legal team who today led Extinction Rebellion to victory in the High Court. Judges decided the total police ban on all environmental protests across London after 8 days of demonstrations was unlawful, as was the arrest of some activists. 400 of those led away, including politicians behind today's legal action, could now sue for damages.
The people who were taking part in many XR actions knew that they were liable for arrest if they were doing things like sitting in the road. I was standing in Trafalgar Square, a pedestrianised public square, doing nothing more than asking the police questions.
Extinction Rebellion's autumn uprising saw groups heading to key locations across the capital. They successfully closed 3 bridges in central London. But judges said these separate groups operating in different places didn't count as a public assembly, forcing the Metropolitan Police to rethink their strategy.
The court made a judgment about the particular sort of technicality of the definition of an assembly, and we'll need to think very carefully about what that means for us when we use the power next time round. But I don't think it's embarrassing in the slightest.
These scenes show XR activists on a train at Canning Town Underground 3 days after the Metropolitan Police introduced the ban. One man's tackled and pulled to the ground by frustrated commuters. Police today said they'd acted partly because of the prolonged disruption caused to thousands of Londoners. In their ruling here at the High Court, the judges made it clear that this did not allow people to stage protests whenever and however they wanted. That there were powers that police could use within the existing law, just not this kind of blanket ban. The aim is to raise awareness through disruption. Today's victory will reinvigorate protesters as they plan their next day of action. Juliette Bremner, ITV News.
Now, the Green Party have launched their general election campaign by calling for a £100 billion a year to be spent on tackling what they call the climate emergency. The party also set out plans to make Britain carbon neutral by 2030, insisting that in dark times, this must be the climate election.
Boris Johnson wants to make this the Brexit election, a rerun of the referendum, a fight on his terms, on his dodgy turf. But some things are even bigger than Brexit. This must be the climate election. The future won't get another chance.
Now, Scotland Yard could face hundreds of claims for compensation after the Extinction Rebellion group won a key High Court challenge against a ban on protests imposed across London. Two senior judges ruled that the Met's decision to ban any assembly of more than 2 people linked to XR's Autumn Uprising campaign was unlawful. Lawyers for the group said potentially hundreds of people who were arrested at the time could now claim for false imprisonment. Our chief correspondent, Alex Thompson, reports.
The fate of scores, perhaps hundreds of arrested protesters depends on this judgment. So too the wider right to demonstrate in this country. Small wonder Extinction Rebellion's legal team allowed themselves a minor fist pump, emerging victorious from court.
Rather than silencing and criminalising Extinction Rebellion's activists, we call on the government to tell the truth and act now on this climate and ecological emergency.
My arrest was unlawful. I was doing absolutely nothing wrong, and I'm very glad that we've had this result, because what it's about is fundamentally the right to protest, the right to public assembly, and those are absolutely central to a functioning democracy. So it's a very important judgment.
Perhaps hundreds of people arrested during the October protests could now sue the police for unlawful arrest and imprisonment. Extinction Rebellion careful to point out today how the right to protest was upheld in a UK court. It's not always the way of this world.
I'd also like to recognise how lucky we are to live in a country in which the courts are free enough to protect us and our rights as they've done today.
The judges ruled that lots of street protests in different locations could not be treated as just one unlawful assembly, even if organised by one group, like Extinction Rebellion. So treating all the protests as one by the police was unlawful, just as some protesters predicted at the time.
I think the police have really messed up on the Section 14 tactic, and I think that it's going to be found illegal in the courts quite soon.
The Metropolitan Police released a lengthy statement today detailing the disruption caused by the days of protests and £24 million in policing costs. They say they would not and cannot ban protest, but suggest the Public Order Act is out of date.
It is 30 years old now, and it was probably framed in a time when protest was not conducted in the way it's now being conducted. You know, it wasn't about long-scale, continual protests over many days in different sites. It was much more, I think, about a single location, a single duration, a single event. So there is an argument potentially to look at the legislation in due course.
Well, multi-locational protests specifically designed to stretch the police and disrupt wide areas can actually be banned already in law if the police use the law properly. Today's judgment was careful to point that out, but to do so requires government to ban protest, nothing less.
But to do that would require the direct sign-off of the Secretary of State, the Home Secretary. In other words, it would be a blatantly political decision. Thus far, that hasn't happened, but Extinction Rebellion have not gone away, and it's a dilemma which remains to be wrestled with.
But first, all those incoming claims for compensation against the Metropolitan Police from Extinction Rebellion demonstrators. They fought the law, and they won.
Alex Thompson reporting.